Is that even a real combat tattoo? Or did you get it at a beach shop? The laughter cut through the humid air of the locker room, bouncing off metal benches and tiled walls still fogged from hot showers as Emily Carter stood with her back turned, water dripping slowly from her hair onto the concrete floor, her frame smaller than most in the room but steady, unmoved, and unmistakably controlled, while three women leaned casually against the lockers behind her, their eyes fixed on the ink etched into her shoulder blade, a design sharp and deliberate, not decorative, but earned, though none of them understood that yet and none of them tried to as one of them stepped closer, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips seriously. Carter, you expect anyone to believe that means something? Another voice chimed in, louder this time, making sure others nearby could hear. Yeah, looks like cosplay for someone who couldn't make it past real selection. And a few scattered chuckles followed as the tension began to spread across the room like heat rising off asphalt under a Texas sun, while Emily reached for her towel, movements slow, precise, not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate as if the noise around her existed somewhere far outside her focus, and she pressed the fabric lightly against her shoulder without covering the tattoo, not hiding it, not offering it either, while the third woman took a step closer, invading the space just enough to test boundaries. What's it supposed to be anyway? Some kind of unit mark? Her fingers hovered for a second before lightly tapping the edge of the ink, a subtle line crossed, the kind that usually sparked a reaction, but not this time because Emily didn't turn, didn't raise her voice, didn't tense her posture. She simply lifted her chin a fraction, eyes forward, and said quietly, "You should step back." Her tone calm, level, carrying no anger but something else, something harder to define, something that didn't belong to someone unsure of herself, and that pause, that brief break in rhythm, almost disrupted the momentum until one of them laughed again, louder now to fill the gap. "Or what?" she said, tilting her head as if waiting for a show, for a reaction, for anything that would justify the attention they were giving her, but Emily gave them nothing more, not a threat, not a warning repeated, just silence that settled heavier than any insult could, while across the room a few others had stopped what they were doing, subtle glances exchanged, sensing that something in the air had shifted even if they couldn't explain why, and just as the moment stretched thin, balanced on the edge of escalation, the locker room door swung open with a sharp metallic sound that cut through the noise like a line drawn clean and final, and footsteps followed, measured, authoritative, the kind that didn't need to rush to command attention as conversations died mid-sentence and heads turned instinctively, because everyone recognized that presence even before they saw him. And as Commander David Hayes stepped inside, his gaze moved once across the room before stopping, locking onto a single point on Emily Carter's shoulder, and in that instant, everything changed, though no one yet understood how or why, and the laughter that had filled the room seconds ago now hung in the air unfinished, like something already regretted before anyone had the chance to take it back. Commander David Hayes did not speak at first, and that silence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could as he took 2 slow steps forward, his boots echoing against the tile floor, while every person in the locker room instinctively straightened without being told, because presence like his did not require instruction, it demanded it, and yet his focus never shifted away from Emily Carter, as if the rest of the room had faded into nothing more than background noise, while the 3 women who had been laughing just seconds ago now stood frozen in place, their confidence draining in real time as uncertainty crept in, one of them lowering her arms, another taking a half step back without realizing it, as if her body had already understood something her mind had not yet caught up to, while Emily remained exactly where she was, posture unchanged, breathing steady, eyes forward, not turning to face him, not reacting to his arrival in any visible way, and that alone felt wrong to everyone watching, because nobody ignored a commander. Not like this, not without consequence, and yet there was no defiance in her stance, only a quiet certainty that made the air feel tighter as Hayes stopped just a few feet behind her, close enough now that the details of the tattoo were clear, every line precise, every edge deliberate, not faded, not decorative, something older than it should have been for someone her age, and something unmistakably familiar to him, as his jaw tightened slightly, a subtle shift, but enough for those who knew him to recognize that something had just changed while across the room a few soldiers exchanged glances. Confusion spreading in silence, because this was not how these moments usually played out. There was no reprimand, no demand for explanation, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next, and one of the women who had spoken earlier tried to recover, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow now. "Sir, we were just joking around," she said, her voice lacking the sharp edge it had before, but Hayes did not acknowledge her, did not even glance in her direction, as if her words had not reached him at all, and that absence of response landed harder than any correction could have, because it made it clear that she no longer mattered in this moment. While Emily finally moved, not turning fully, just enough to shift her weight, the towel dropping slightly from her shoulder, revealing the tattoo in full. No hesitation, no attempt to explain it, no need to, and for a brief second the room held its breath as Hayes drew in a slow breath of his own, eyes locked onto the mark, something unreadable passing through them, recognition, layered with something deeper, something that did not belong in a place like this. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but carried across the room with absolute clarity. "Where did you earn that?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a confirmation of something he already knew. And that was the moment everything shifted, because the question itself was not what stunned them, it was how he asked it, not like a superior addressing a subordinate, but like a man, acknowledging something rare, something earned the hard way. And for the first time since the laughter had started, the room understood that they had been looking at the wrong person all along. While Emily Carter finally turned just enough to meet his gaze, her expression calm, unshaken, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before any of them had stepped into it, and the answer she was about to give would decide everything that followed. Emily Carter held his gaze for a fraction longer than protocol would normally allow, not out of defiance, but because she understood exactly what he was asking and why it mattered. Then she answered in a voice just above a whisper, steady and unshaken. "Red Canyon, sir, Northern Sector, joint operation, 3 years ago." And the words landed with a weight that most in the room could not fully grasp, but they felt it anyway, like a shift in pressure before a storm. As Commander Hayes exhaled slowly, a controlled release, as if something inside him had just been confirmed beyond doubt, his posture tightening even further before, without hesitation, without looking to anyone else for acknowledgement, he brought his hand up sharply to his brow in a clean, precise salute, the kind reserved for moments that carried meaning beyond rank and routine. And that was the instant the room stopped breathing, because no one had ever seen a commander salute someone like this. Not in a locker room. Not in a moment like this. Not to someone they had been laughing at less than a minute ago. While the 3 women nearest to Emily felt the ground shift beneath them, one of them lowering her eyes, another stepping back fully now, creating distance, as if proximity itself had suddenly become a mistake that could not be undone. While across the room the others stood rigid, unsure whether to mirror the gesture or remain still, caught between confusion and instinct, as Emily did not return the salute immediately, not out of disrespect, but because her eyes stayed locked on his, reading something there that went deeper than recognition, something personal, something carried from a place most of them had never been. And finally, she lifted her hand, returning the salute with the same precision, the same control, no flourish, no hesitation, just quiet acknowledgement. And when their hands dropped, the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, filled with unspoken understanding that passed between them in a way that no one else could fully interpret. As Hayes spoke again, his voice lower now, but unmistakably firm. "I was there," he said, and that single statement changed everything again, because it was no longer just recognition. It was shared history, something that connected them in a way rank alone never could. While a ripple of realization moved through the room, fragmented and incomplete, but enough to break whatever assumptions had existed before. As the woman who had first laughed swallowed hard, her earlier confidence gone completely, replaced by something closer to regret, as she glanced at the tattoo again, seeing it now not as decoration, but as something earned somewhere far beyond her understanding. While Emily shifted slightly, finally turning her body more fully toward him, her expression still calm, still unreadable, but her voice carried a subtle edge now, not sharp, not aggressive, just honest. Then you know what it stands for, she said, and Hayes gave a single nod, slow and deliberate. I do, he replied, and that was all that needed to be said because the meaning did not belong in this room. It belonged somewhere else, somewhere that had shaped both of them in ways they others could only guess at, while behind them the locker room remained frozen, no one daring to speak, no one willing to break the moment as the weight of what had just happened settled over them all, and for the first time since the laughter had started, respect did not feel like a concept. It felt like something real, something that had just been learned the hard way. Even if none of them would ever admit it out loud, no one moved for several seconds after those words settled into the air, not because they were ordered to stand still, but because something instinctive held them there, a quiet understanding that whatever had just passed between Emily Carter and Commander Hayes did not belong to casual conversation or explanation, as the faint hum of ventilation filled the silence, louder now that the laughter had completely vanished, and even the smallest movements felt amplified. A locker door creaking somewhere in the background, the soft drip of water hitting tile, while Hayes lowered his hand fully and studied her for a moment longer, not as a superior evaluating a subordinate, but as someone measuring something far more personal, something earned and carried rather than assigned, and then, without raising his voice, he spoke again. You kept it hidden, he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what he had observed as Emily gave the smallest nod, her gaze steady. It was not relevant here, she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no need to justify the choice because she understood something the others in the room were only beginning to grasp. That recognition was not something she sought, and respect was not something she demanded, while Hayes exhaled through his nose, a faint sign of acknowledgement, as if her answer aligned with something he had expected all along, and for a brief moment, the edges of his expression softened, not into a smile, but into something closer to approval before he shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to address the rest of the room, without fully breaking the connection of the moment, and that subtle change was enough to send a ripple through the onlookers as spines straightened further and eyes snapped forward, attention locking into place, while the three women who had been at the center of it all now stood with their shoulders squared, but their earlier confidence nowhere to be found, replaced by a rigid stillness that came from realizing they had misjudged something they should have recognized, as Hayes let his gaze pass over them briefly, not lingering, not calling them out directly, but making it unmistakably clear that he had seen everything that mattered without needing a single explanation, and that silent acknowledgement carried more weight than any formal reprimand could have as he finally spoke to the room, his voice calm but firm. Standards are not always visible, he said, each word measured, deliberate, and neither is experience. And he let that settle for a second, just long enough for the meaning to take hold before continuing. You would do well to remember that. There was no anger in his tone, no raised volume, but the message landed clean and sharp, cutting through whatever assumptions had existed before, as no one responded. No one even shifted their weight because the lesson did not invite discussion. It simply existed, undeniable and complete, while Emily remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence unchanged, as if none of this had altered her position in the slightest, and in that stillness, she seemed even more out of place to those who had underestimated her, not because she stood above them, but because she had never been where they thought she was to begin. As Hayes finally broke his gaze from her, giving a small nod that was not formal but carried its own kind of respect before he turned toward the door, his steps measured once again, controlled, leaving the room without another word, and as the door closed behind him, the tension did not immediately release, it lingered, heavy and undeniable, as the room slowly began to breathe again, but nothing returned to the way it had been just minutes before, because now every glance toward Emily carried a different weight, not curiosity, not judgment, but something quieter, something learned. Even if none of them were ready to say it out loud, the door clicked shut behind Commander Hayes, and for a moment no one moved, as if the sound itself had sealed the room in place, holding everyone exactly where they stood, while the weight of what had just happened settled deeper into their shoulders and into their thoughts, heavier now without his presence to anchor it, as the three women who had started it all stood nearest to Emily Carter, but not nearly as close as before, a noticeable gap between them that had not been there minutes ago, one of them shifting her weight awkwardly, glancing at the floor before forcing herself to look back up at Emily's shoulder, at the tattoo she had mocked so casually, now studying it as if trying to understand something she had never been meant to recognize while the others in the room slowly returned to motion. But it was different now, quieter, more measured. Conversations starting in low voices that did not quite rise above a murmur, as if everyone was aware that something had changed and did not want to disturb it further, while Emily reached down and picked up her towel again, this time draping it loosely over her shoulder, not to hide the mark, but simply because the moment for it had passed, her movements calm, unhurried, the same as they had been before any of this began as she stepped toward the bench and began gathering her gear with quiet efficiency, boots aligned, uniform folded, every action deliberate and controlled while one of the women finally spoke, her voice lacking the sharpness it had earlier. "We did not know," she said, the words coming out uneven, as if she had rehearsed something else but settled on the simplest truth instead, and Emily did not look up immediately, did not rush to respond, just continued what she was doing before answering in the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. "You were not supposed to." And that response hung in the air, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual, leaving no room for argument as the woman swallowed and nodded slightly, unsure of what else to say because there was no easy way to step back from where she had been just moments ago while another voice, quieter this time, added, "That operation, was it really?" But the question faded before it could fully form, the uncertainty stopping at mid-sentence because even asking felt like crossing a line that had suddenly become visible, and Emily finally looked up then, meeting their eyes one by one, not with anger, not with superiority, but with something far more grounding, a calm that did not invite speculation or curiosity beyond what was necessary, as she shook her head once, small and controlled. "It does not matter here," she said, and that was the end of it. The boundary drawn clearly without needing to be reinforced while across the room someone adjusted their posture. Another quietly closed a locker, small sounds filling the space again, but none of them carrying the same careless energy as before as the shift in atmosphere remained, subtle but undeniable, woven into every movement and every glance as Emily slipped into her uniform, each piece fitting into place with practiced ease, her focus returning to the routine that had been interrupted, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply moving forward as if the moment that had just reshaped the room was already behind her while the others watched, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to mark the difference between before and after, the space she occupied now defined not by assumptions but by something earned, something they had witnessed without fully understanding, and as she finished, adjusting the final detail of her sleeve, she paused just briefly, her reflection caught in the mirror across from her, eyes steady, expression unchanged, as if confirming something only she could see before turning away and heading toward the exit, leaving behind a room that would not forget what had just happened, even if no one would speak about it out loud. The hallway outside the locker room felt colder, quieter, the sharp echo of boots against polished floors replacing the humid noise she had left behind as Emily Carter stepped out without hesitation, her pace steady, neither rushed nor slow, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had while behind her the door remained closed, sealing in the moment that had just unfolded as she moved down the corridor, passing rows of framed commendations and mission photographs that most people glanced at without really seeing. But her eyes flickered across them with recognition that ran deeper than surface level, details registering in a way that came from experience rather than curiosity, while a pair of junior personnel approaching from the opposite direction straightened instinctively as she neared, offering a quick nod of acknowledgement that she returned with the same minimal gesture, nothing more, nothing less. Her presence neither demanding attention nor avoiding it, simply existing with quiet authority that did not need explanation as she turned a corner toward the operations wing. The atmosphere shifting subtly again, less casual here, more structured, voices lower, movements more deliberate as the rhythm of the bass settled into something familiar and controlled while inside a nearby office. Commander Hayes stood by a window, hands resting lightly against the edge of a desk, his posture composed, but his focus distant for a brief moment before the door opened softly behind him and a senior officer stepped in, pausing just long enough to read the room before speaking. "I heard there was an incident in the locker room," the officer said carefully, not accusatory, just observant as Hayes did not turn immediately, his gaze still fixed on the glass in front of him, reflecting a version of himself that had just shifted in a way few would understand before he finally responded, his voice even, controlled. "Not an incident," he said. "A reminder," and that distinction carried weight, enough to stop any further assumptions before they formed. While back in the hallway, Emily continued forward, her boots hitting the floor in a consistent rhythm that matched the steady pace of her thoughts, not replaying what had happened, not analyzing it, because for her it had never been about proving anything. It had simply been another moment where perception caught up to reality. Something she had learned long ago would happen sooner or later. As she reached the briefing room door, pausing for just a second before pushing it open and stepping inside where a small group had already gathered, conversations fading as she entered, a few eyes lifting, some curious, some neutral, none carrying the same dismissive edge that might have been there before, even if they did not know why. As she moved to an empty seat, placing her gear down with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else, her posture settling into place without drawing attention. While across the room, two individuals exchanged a brief glance, something unspoken passing between them as if word had already begun to travel, not in detail, not in full understanding, but enough to shift the way she was seen, even in spaces she had not yet entered. As the briefing officer cleared his throat, pulling focus back to the front, the routine continuing, orders, updates, objectives, all delivered in the same structured cadence as always. And yet for Emily, and for a few others now, there was an added layer beneath it, something unspoken but present, a recognition that not everything worth knowing was written on a file or displayed on a uniform. And as the briefing progressed, she listened without interruption, absorbing information with the same calm focus she had carried through every moment before, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if the line between who she was before and who they now understood her to be had never actually existed at all. The briefing room settled into a steady rhythm as the officer at the front outlined the day's objectives, a large digital display casting a soft blue glow across the walls, while rows of seated personnel listened with varying levels of focus, some taking notes, others simply watching and absorbing. As Emily Carter sat near the middle, posture straight, hands resting lightly on the table in front of her, her attention fixed forward, processing every detail without distraction. While the earlier moment in the locker room lingered not in her mind but in the subtle shifts around her, small things that most would miss, but she noticed instinctively. The way voices near her were slightly more measured, the way no one spoke over her when she quietly asked for a clarification point, the way a seat beside her remained empty just a fraction longer than usual before someone finally took it without making eye contact, as if unsure of the unspoken rules that now surrounded her. While across the room, two individuals who had been present earlier exchanged a brief glance again, not in mockery this time, but in quiet acknowledgement of something they were still trying to understand. As the briefing continued, coordinates, timelines, responsibilities laid out in precise order, each detail fitting into a larger structure that demanded discipline and clarity. While Emily followed along effortlessly, her familiarity with the flow evident in the way she anticipated transitions, her focus never breaking even as the room shifted slightly with the arrival of Commander Hayes at the back, his presence noted immediately but not announced as he stood with arms loosely at his sides, observing rather than interrupting, his eyes moving across the room before settling briefly on Emily, not in scrutiny, but in recognition before continuing on, as if ensuring everything remained as it should. While the officer at the front moved into operational assignments, names being called one by one, roles distributed based on skill and availability. As the tone remained neutral, professional, until a slight pause occurred, almost imperceptible, before Emily's name was spoken. "Carter, you will be on reconnaissance support for Sector 3. The assignment delivered without emphasis but followed by a subtle shift in the room, a quiet awareness that the role carried weight, not because of what was said but because of what was implied. As Emily gave a single nod, acknowledging the assignment without comment, her expression unchanged, accepting it as she accepted everything else, without hesitation or display, while a voice from the side, cautious but curious, spoke up. "Sir, is that sector not restricted to advanced clearance personnel?" The question carefully phrased. Not challenging, but seeking clarity as the officer at the front glanced briefly toward the back of the room where Hayes stood, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second before returning forward as the response came evenly. "Carter meets the requirements." No further explanation offered, none needed as the room absorbed that statement in silence, the implications settling in different ways for different people while Emily remained still, her focus returning to the display, already adjusting her internal framework to the assignment, mapping out what needed to be done, what variables would come into play, her mind operating in quiet precision while the briefing moved on, other names, other roles, the structure continuing as it always did, and yet beneath it all, something had shifted, not in procedure, not in command, but in perception, a recalibration that was still settling into place as Hayes remained at the back, watching for a moment longer before turning slightly toward the exit, his expression composed. His presence no longer needed to reinforce what had already been established as the door opened softly and closed again behind him, leaving the room to continue as if nothing had happened. Even though for those who had witnessed earlier, nothing would quite look the same again. The briefing concluded with a sharp nod from the officer at the front, and chairs shifted back in near unison, the controlled scrape of metal against the floor echoing briefly before fading into low conversation as personnel began to file out in an orderly flow, groups forming naturally. Voices kept measured but no longer silent, while Emily Carter remained seated for a moment longer, eyes still on the display as it powered down, the faint glow disappearing from the screen as the room returned to its neutral tone, and only then did she rise, gathering her gear with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement she made since stepping into the locker room earlier. Nothing rushed, nothing delayed, just deliberate as she stepped into the aisle and moved toward the exit. The flow of people parting just slightly without anyone consciously directing it, a subtle adjustment that spoke louder than any words exchanged. While outside in the corridor the pace of the base had picked up, boots moving with purpose, voices carrying brief updates, the hum of daily operations continuing uninterrupted as if the earlier moment had never happened. And yet within that rhythm, something had changed, something quieter, harder to define as Emily walked toward the staging area for her assigned sector, her path direct, her focus already shifting forward to what came next. While behind her, a voice called out, hesitant at first, "Carter," and she stopped, turning just enough to acknowledge without fully breaking her forward momentum as one of the women from the locker room approached, her posture straighter now, but her expression more controlled, less certain than before as she came to a stop a few feet away, leaving space that had not existed earlier, a clear boundary recognized this time without being asked for. As she took a breath, choosing her words carefully, "About earlier," she began, but paused, the rest of the sentence never fully forming as Emily watched her, not impatient, not encouraging, simply waiting as the woman exhaled slightly, shifting her weight before settling on the only thing that seemed appropriate. "I was wrong," she said finally, the words quiet but clear, and for a moment neither of them moved, the hallway continuing around them, people passing, conversations flowing. But that small exchange existing in its own space as Emily studied her for a brief second, not searching for sincerity because she had already heard it in the tone, but measuring something else, something internal before giving a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood," she replied. No emphasis, no lecture, just acceptance as she turned back toward her path, continuing forward without adding anything more, leaving the moment complete without needing to expand it, while the woman remained where she stood, watching her go for a second longer before stepping aside, the space she had taken earlier now clearly not hers to claim again, as Emily reached the staging area where equipment was being organized with quiet efficiency, personnel checking lists, verifying assignments, the environment structured and focused as she moved into position seamlessly, picking up her assigned gear and running through it with practiced familiarity, her hands moving with the confidence of repetition, each check precise, each adjustment exact while a nearby team member glanced toward her briefly, then nodded once in acknowledgement. Nothing exaggerated, nothing forced, just a simple recognition that had not been there before as Emily returned the nod in kind, her attention already shifting back to the task at hand as instructions were called out, timelines confirmed, and movement began to organize into execution while above it all, the base continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the small but significant shift that had taken place within its walls, a shift not recorded in any report, not announced in any briefing, but carried quietly in the way people now moved around one individual who had never asked for recognition and never needed it to begin with. The staging area transitioned from preparation to movement, with a quiet efficiency that did not require raised voices or repeated orders. Teams forming into their assigned units as final checks were completed and equipment secured. While Emily Carter stood at the edge of her group, her gaze scanning once across the layout, not searching for direction but confirming alignment, each detail already mapped in her mind as she adjusted the strap on her pack and stepped into position, her presence blending seamlessly into the formation and yet standing apart in a way that did not draw attention but held it once noticed as the team lead gave a brief signal and the group began to move, boots striking the ground in a steady rhythm that carried them toward their assigned sector, the base unfolding around them in layers of controlled motion, vehicles passing at measured speeds, personnel exchanging quick acknowledgments, everything operating within a system built on precision and trust. While Emily moved with the same calm focus that had defined every moment before, her awareness extending beyond the immediate path, noting movement, spacing, timing, all without visible effort, as if the environment itself spoke a language she understood fluently and did not need to translate. While beside her, one of the team members glanced in her direction, then forward again, the briefest flicker of curiosity replaced quickly by acceptance as the group reached their staging vehicle, gear loaded with practiced coordination, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words, as Emily secured her equipment and took her place without hesitation, her actions aligning perfectly with the flow of the team as the engine started with a low hum, the sound blending into the larger rhythm of the bass. While inside the vehicle the atmosphere settled into focused silence, each individual preparing in their own way, some reviewing data, others simply sitting still, conserving energy, the space filled with quiet intention as Emily sat near the rear, her posture relaxed but ready, eyes forward, her breathing even, unaffected by the shift from preparation to execution, because for her there was no difference, only continuation. While outside, the vehicle began to move, the base slowly receding behind them as they headed toward the assigned coordinates, the landscape changing gradually, structures giving way to open terrain, distances measured not just in miles but in responsibility as time passed in steady increments, the team maintaining formation, communication minimal but precise as Emily's focus remained constant, her mind tracking variables, adjusting expectations, always a step ahead without ever appearing rushed. And in that stillness, that quiet control, there was something that could not be taught through instruction or replicated through routine, something earned through moments that were never spoken about in rooms like the one they had left behind. While miles away, back at the base, the locker room had returned to its normal state, voices rising again, movement casual, but the memory of what had happened lingered in subtle ways, in the pauses before certain words, in the glances that now carried more weight than before, in the unspoken understanding that not everything could be measured at first glance. And as the vehicle carrying Emily Carter disappeared further into the distance, merging with the horizon, the difference between who she had been perceived to be and who she truly was no longer mattered. Because for those who had seen it, even for a moment, the lesson had already been learned, quietly, completely, and without the need for anything more.